everyone. I know we have some people who don't normally come to the social epi seminar here today as well. I think Charlie will be talking about an interest that is, or an area that's of interest to a lot of us. So I think most of you know Charlie Poole. He's an associate professor here in the Department of Epidemiology. And I don't think he needs further introduction, so I will hand things over to him. And one other announcement, I think we're going to have some really good discussion at the end. The class ends at 1:10, and we do have a class come in after us, so we just need to be mindful of that and you know, take the conversations outside if they keep going. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I didn't think this was a class, but it was a seminar, and I hope we'll have discussion as we go along, as opposed to the end. So these terms, causal architecture, population health science, and consequentialist epidemiology are terms coined by Sandro Galea and Carey Keys. And they're at the very broadest level of abstraction, which is not the kind of area where I feel comfortable.
Carolyn?
I'm sorry.
Since we're allowed to have discussion,
Yeah, start in right away with my title slide.
I just would like to clarify that's probably true about causal architecture and consequentialist epidemiology, but not population health.
Oh, okay. Would you like to discuss that now or when I get to that part?
Well, there's a long history of population health science.
Well, there is population health science as it's been defined by many people and in many contexts.
Yeah.
Then there's population health science as Sandro and Carey.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say the aspects of all three of these that I'll be considering are at a very broad level and involve what are often called paradigm shifts, foundational principles, what is our discipline and what should it be doing. I always have felt very uncomfortable at that level of things, and I've tried to stay out of that kind of a discussion. Every now and then I get dragged into it. Now this call for I even say a revolution, at least the kind of revolution Thomas Kuhn wrote about, or a new paradigm, a new set of foundational principles, whatever, it looks eerily similar to one that our field of epi went through, mainly back in the 90s and maybe the first, in a big way, the first few years of the 21st century. And I prepared, 30 slides on that history for you, and I tucked them away. So I won't be, because I realize that would take up the whole, that easily could take up the whole time. As Carey and Sandro have written on this set of foundational principles they'd like us to turn to, it's been brought to their attention that really what they're saying has roots in that earlier discussion and debate, and they've been more and more recently embedding their proposals in that and calling this an extension or a continuation of that. But I'm only going to refer to that whole discussion here and there. If you want, I can dive into those slides, but there are lots of them. Including the one occasion when I got dragged into that and actually published a paper on that topic. I didn't want to, but I became obliged to, let's put it that way. So the order in which I'll take these up will be what Carey and Sandro mean by consequentialist epidemiology, and then what they mean by causal architecture. And it seems to me that this, for them, is now being embedded in what they're calling population health science. So, of course, I have multiple publications by Sandro and Carey to work with. Also, Sandro gave our John Causal lecture this past spring. That was helpful. I read an Epidemiology interview, which was very helpful with Sandro. After he spoke on these topics as his outgoing presidential address from the Society for Epidemiologic Research. And I had the privilege of being part of a 2-day workshop in May up in McGill, where Carey was also on the workshop, and we spent, the group spent a good hour to an hour and a half talking about one of these topics, trying to answer the question, what is consequentialist epidemiology? And I'm aided most by this brand new book, which Sandro and Carey sent to me for free, because they know that I'm in the process of writing a commentary that's going to accompany their next paper on this topic. So you can look for that coming out in a few months in the journal Epidemiology. And so, just in case you weren't aware, this is the visionary Sandro Galea, and oops, I'm sorry, and above and to the left his self-described protege, Carey. So we'll start with consequential epidemiology. Sandro, I think, is now an editor at the American Journal of Public Health, and so here's an editorial talking about consequentialist public health. And one of the questions I have at this level is, are we talking about redefining what epidemiology is all about, or what public health is all about, or what epidemiology's role in public health is all about? This, to me, is often unclear in discussions like this. And here, this is an announcement for, I think, a monthly column or set of articles. The first one of which, the first one of which was by Sandro and Carey on the concept of consequential epidemiology. This is probably, of the writings, the one that's clearest to me as to what they mean by consequential epidemiology, or consequentialist. It starts as the critique of what epidemiology was all about back in the 90s started with a critique of so-called risk factor epidemiology. Now, as best as I have been able to tell over decades, risk factor epidemiology is the epidemiology of behaviors and exposures, as opposed to the upstream social, political, economic, and cultural influences on behaviors and exposures, or the downstream molecular, biological, genetic, etc. Determinants of death, disease, and disability. And this critique has focused specifically on one person, Ken Rothman, and specifically on his book, the first edition, at first, as the bête noire of risk factor epidemiology, the reason why everything has gone wrong. Part of this has been that if you study individual exposures and behaviors, you will only think of individualized, medicalized, one person at a time interventions. To me, this is a dubious assertion. It's never backed up with any kind of evidence. It's just stated. I find it very easy to think of counterexamples. We studied folic acid and neural tube defects at the individual level, and this didn't prevent anyone from thinking, hey, let's fortify the food supply, a population level intervention. And I could give you counterexample after counterexample. But anyway, we start with a critique of risk factor epidemiology, and then we go on. Now, that earlier discussion, the there that I saw there, to paraphrase Dorothy Parker, was an effort to promote and advocate on behalf of social epidemiology. There was lots of talks about new paradigms, and there were fractals and Chinese boxes, and somebody had a cube. But the thing that I could understand in that discussion was social epidemiology needs more of a seat at the table. That is part of this critique and proposal as well. It begins with setting up what I believe is primarily a straw man, risk factor epidemiology, and often framed as an alternative. So instead of doing risk factor, instead of studying the associations, and hopefully some of them winding up being accepted as causal, between behaviors and exposures on the one hand and health outcomes on the other. Instead of doing that, let's do something else, as opposed to, in addition to doing that, let's do some other things. Now, part of this critique is a look back now on the past couple of decades at where social epidemiology has come since that time. And it reminds me a little bit of what people were saying about Barack Obama a few months ago when Bernie Sanders was at his peak and Barack Obama's approval rating was at its lowest. I heard Heather McGhee say, she's one of my favorite people I watch on TV about the news. Of course, Barack Obama hasn't accomplished anything. These days, with his high approval ratings, there's another story, right? So sometimes complete 100% success, all your dreams coming true, it can be looked at as abject failure, or it can be looked at as progress and we still have more to do. I kind of see that here. Now, you all know better, or most of you. Certain the one person who's spoken up so far knows better than I do. Has a more informed opinion on where social epi is today compared with where it was, let's say, in 1990. My impression is that it's come a long way and it's got more of a seat at the table. Now, Sandro Galea is a social epidemiologist who became a dean of a school of public health in his 40s. For someone like that to say, our attempt to promote social epidemiology has been a complete failure, it's tough, you know. And there's another school of public health that has a dean who is a social epidemiologist, Drexel, in DSU. So, but I don't know. It seems to me there's been some progress and a lot more progress still to come, but that's part of this. Now, what is it about an epidemiology that makes it consequential? Sometimes they write a paper and they never say. This paper comes the closest, so I would recommend, and I'll make the slides available, comes the closest to actually saying what is a consequential epidemiology that I can find. But by and large, it's left up to you. So it's sort of a Rorschach test. Whatever you think is consequential, you can read that into the ink blot. Precise causal effects of exposures on an outcome at the expense of engagement with the broader causal architecture that produces public health. Okay? And already we're talking about an epidemiology of consequence without actually saying what it is. This has really caught on, so now we see in sub-discipline after sub-discipline is occupational epidemiology consequential enough? Howie Frum can ask that question. Martha Warrow, how can we make the study of birth defects more consequential? And I think when you read these papers, you'll see different views on what it takes to make an epidemiology consequential. Now, the best I can tell, and I'm going, this is in descending order of how sure I am that this is what Carey and Sandra are talking about, is that we need more. And I'm going to describe this as more emphasis on rather than doing this instead of doing whatever it is that we think, that we put up as the straw man. More emphasis on the study of actual interventions. What in my former time as a health administration student we would call program evaluation. But there are actual interventions and we can study the effects of them. There were studies of the effects on health and longevity in Iraq of the sanctions that were placed on the Saddam Hussein regime. That would be, I think, that the kind of thing that is being argued that we should do more of, and I have no objection to that. An emphasis on picking the things, the exposure, the risk factors we're going to study on things that are manipulable and we might be able to intervene on. I'm pretty sure that everything else being equal, a more modifiable determinant of disease or potential determinant you're studying, the more consequentialist your work is likely to be. Clearly, I think risk factors for which the interventions might have a big public health impact are emphasized here. There is a view that you might have, I happen to have it, that much of public health is a lot of little tiny small things. But here we're looking at home runs, smoking, motor vehicle, deaths on the highway. They have been reduced dramatically. Things like, by a series of interventions, things like that, as opposed to rare diseases, weak effects, and an accumulation of that kind. Clearly an emphasis here on upstream risk factors and interventions, social, political, economic, things dear to our hearts in this room, as opposed to downstream risk behaviors, exposures, or even farther downstream biological, molecular kind of things. I think that there's an emphasis on the study of, or study estimates of the hypothetical effect of, they haven't happened yet, multi-pronged interventions. So as opposed to a single thing we're going to do, maybe 4 or 5 things we're going to do at the same time. And an emphasis, perhaps, the last one I don't see at all, but it might be added to the list. Here's an intervention. What are its effects on all possible health outcomes as opposed to just one at a time? So that, in a nutshell, is so far what I'm hearing when people are discussing consequential epidemiology. Yes?
So I'm surprised that number, the second point on your list, risk factors in which you might intervene. Being so one of the critiques of social epidemiology is often that, you study risk factors or exposure, so to speak, that can't be interviewed from, like race. So is there also within this a call for a broader view on the type of risk factors that are interviewed?
Yeah, I'm going to wind up the essay. You have to ask them to a lot of the questions. But when we were talking with Carey, she said you have to ask Sandra. We're not going to intervene on race. We're going to intervene on things that, let's say, interact with race, structural racism, institutional racism, prejudice, and the perception of someone's race and the structures that we're in or the actions people have wind up having adverse health consequences. The intervention there would not be on the race, but on the modified effect. That's the way I look at it. I'm hoping that's the way they look at it. And I saw you nodding, so I hope you look at it that way too. So that's it, as far as I can tell, at least in a nutshell, on makes an epidemiology consequential. So a lot of it, to me, would have to do with what you pick to study as your dissertation topic. Are you going to pick a more upstream thing or a more downstream thing? Are you going to pick something that we can imagine, perhaps more feasibly intervening on, or something that would be less able to intervene on? Are you going to pick a common outcome or a rare outcome? Are you going to pick a common risk factor where if we make a change in it, even if there's a weak effect, it might have a big public health impact. This, I think, is one way in which thinking consequentially might play itself out, perhaps in the selection of research topics. And then, of course, we get into our data analysis. Mostly what we study is everybody gets something versus nobody. So an example I use over and over again is the study of among black women experiencing discrimination because of their race in various areas of life, at work, in housing, etc. Studied in the Black Women's Health Study. The contrast we usually draw is every black woman is treated unfairly at work, no black women are treated unfairly at work. That isn't something I think that it would be hard to defend that from a consequentialist standpoint. In one study, in the Black Women's Health Study, 53%, I think, of women reported they had been treated unfairly at work. 31% reported they had been treated unfairly in housing. We might imagine some kind of intervention that might reduce that to from 50-something down to 25%, or from 31% down to 10%. That might be more realistic and might more accurately characterize the consequences of some intervention. But I don't see a whole lot of people glomming onto that suggestion. For one thing, how much of a reduction do we think can happen? For another thing, that estimated effect is always going to be smaller than the estimated effect of everybody exposed, nobody exposed. Occasionally we see this. I keep citing Laura Lair's wonderful dissertation where she, on BMI, looked at possible shifts in the distribution. Shifts in distributions are a key element explicitly in what Carey and Sandra were talking about. Okay, let's move to the second, which is causal architecture. And I think, at least in their framework, these are embedded in this larger thing that they're calling their version of population health science. So this is a table from the book, in the causal architecture part of the book. So in the causal isolationist approach, which is, I think, a kind of an unfair caricature of what we ordinarily do, we ask, is E associated with D? And in the causal architecture, we ask, what is the structure of causes that underlie D? Now, if we really want to do a good job of figuring out what to do about selection bias and confounding, we're going to have a system and draw something called a directed acyclic graph. That's not the kind of diagram they're talking about, but you're going to need that if you want to get a good estimate of E's association with D. And it's going to require, at least for the things that are upstream of E, you to know something about the structure of causes that underlie D. So here, I don't see it as either or. I see it as a matter of emphasis. Is E associated with D controlling for a set of confounders? Straw man. Do these causes work together or separately? So here, in causal isolation, we're worried about bias. And in causal architecture, we're interested in studying interaction and effect measure modification. This is a crucial element of population health science, which we can talk about. There are different views in our field about how interested we should be in interactions and in effect measure modification. There's a strong view out there that you shouldn't look at modifiers. You should be very careful. You should have a list of 3 and specify them in advance. There's another view, this one, which is we're not going to learn much at all if we don't study interactions. So are these either or do we need to do both? Does E interact with any factors to produce D? Well, that kind of looks to me like this point over here. What are the mechanisms through which E works? Which causes are the most prevalent in the population for which we want to improve public health? All right, now this to me is selecting the risk factor you're going to study or the thing you're going to intervene on. This is, once you intervene on it, how is it going to manifest its effect? And here we get into a topic that is addressed here. That goes back to that old discussion. It's all about black box epidemiology, which had two variants. One of which was how ideologically, people say biologically, but it's really ideologically plausible is this hypothetical causal association we're looking at. How plausible does it need to be? ... For what? For some kind of action, etc. To take this association seriously and continue to study it. Another part is how much research priority should we put into studying the mechanisms by which even established things that affect disease, things we all believe affect disease, actually go about doing it. Those are two very different questions to me. The debate, really, actually the debate centered on both of those topics. How plausible does it need to be? How much should we, once we accept something as causal, how much should we look into the details of the mechanisms? Mediation research is portrayed today largely as a matter of doing the latter, and we're seeing an explosion of mediation research, for better or for worse.
So when I see this, Charlie, I work in the autism field where it's very multifactorial, and in a lot of these environmental risk studies, they look at something like air pollution, and before you even do that study, you know that at best you can find maybe 5% attributable fraction if you can establish causality. So what I'm seeing here is why waste your time in the weeds on something that might be causal but affects so little of your disease, when you could look at the architecture and say air pollution could be causal, but let's not waste our time on it, because if we got rid of it, we might only get rid of 1% of cases.
That is clearly what Sandro and Carey are saying. Let's look for, in the consequential part, and here as it plays out in the causal architecture part. Let's look for the home runs. Let's not waste our time in Andy Olshan studying neuroblastoma. It only happens 600 times a year in the United States. There is another view, I happen to hold it, which is, yeah, we love home runs when we can get them. But there's also the bunt single and the, getting the guy around to third. Sorry for the baseball analogy. And I think a lot of public health is the accumulation of small discoveries, research, estimating the effects of things, and then actions and accumulating. People have different views. Carey and Sandro are clearly emphasizing the home runs for thinking about interventions and therefore thinking about things to study.
Well, I guess I'm sorry if I'm...
I thought I was agreeing with you, but go ahead.
No, what I'm just saying is maybe I've only been in this field for a little while, but it seems that sometimes people are bunting with no one on base. That if you're not beating, you're taking these little steps, but you're not moving towards anywhere. If there's no one on third base, why suicide squeeze?
And this is, I have to say, this is the field, I hope I don't insult anyone, but I think there's selection bias for coming to this into this room at this hour. And that is, I look at much genetic evidence that way. Especially when it isn't genetics interacting with something. And even then, the main thing I can see about that is that we're going to talk about targeting interventions. And as we'll see, I hope, in what's that, the 9 principles of population health science that Sandro and Carey have laid out, targeted interventions are down on the list. It's a very Jeffrey Rose kind of thing, and one of the main elements of Jeffrey Rose's thinking was that he was an anti-targeted intervention. So I think when I find myself agreeing with what you just said, the first thing I think of is much of genetic evidence. But there are many other areas where either because we can't intervene on it, in principle, like race, or we would find it hard to, or very difficult to, or because the effect might be small, or the population impact of an intervention might be small, that it wouldn't be a home run, and we might, and from the standpoint they're representing, we might put it at a lower priority. So the paper that laid this out, Carey didn't happen to be on, and it gave this as an example. So this is not a causal, a directed acyclic graph. Several of you, I'm sure, already noticed that we have neighborhood income affecting school quality, affecting education level, affecting household income, affecting neighborhood income. Isn't a DAG, it's a system diagram. And it was the example in this paper that they could only talk about because they hadn't done the analysis yet. But the example has now been published, and this is the diagram from it. So this would be the kind of thing you would do if you were interested in studying simultaneously all aspects of a system that results in a population distribution of BMI. Now the example as it was described in the first paper went on to cardiovascular disease, but the published version of the paper ended at BMI. Now, this is a valuable thing to do. Systems analysis with health or health-related endpoints in populations is an exceedingly valuable thing to do, especially in policy analysis, because you can say, oh, I'm going to tweak this, or I'm going to tweak that and that with some intervention. What's going to happen? DAGs are useful for selection bias and confounding in studies. This is the kind of thing, if you wanted, you would do it to understand a system in an actual population, and perhaps how you might think about interventions that are going to affect what comes out of that system. Now, we have a graduate, Dan Tabor. I had the privilege, really, of being on his dissertation committee, who is continuing his subject matter interest in school-based policies related to BMI. So he studied state-level Board of Education policies about soft drinks and vending machines and soft drinks in the cafeteria, et cetera, and trends in child BMI around the United States. And he's still studying that. But he's doing it in a systems analysis way now. So he's doing full-time what Sandro and colleagues are calling for more to be done of. Sometimes I read it and they seem to be saying this is what epidemiology students should be learning how to do, instead of learning how to do studies to estimate the effect of E on D. And sometimes they seem to be saying this is what public health should be doing more. And sometimes they seem to be saying when we do our epidemiology of E and whether it affects, and if so, how much and in what direction does it affect D, we should be thinking about and interfacing with the use of our work in that kind of a system.
I just want to put a plug in here for Jim Koopman, who was talking about this like way long ago, and had gotten in to start dabbling on his own
Absolutely.
as an epidemiologist
So
into these types
Jim was
of
pushing
models.
for more systems analysis and epidemiology in the 80s. Not only in infectious disease, where it's kind of obvious, that's what transmission modeling is all about, but in other things. There are socially contagious behaviors, like smoking, for instance, or sexual activity without a condom in high school, and a big promoter of that. Here we're at a larger scale, same idea. And in fact, when I was thinking about, the paper that said, Orr et al. Is coming along, and it came along a few years later, I knew there was a guy from Michigan on the paper, and I thought it was Jim Koopman. It was George Kaplan. That's how much I've associated in my mind systems analysis with Jim. So Dan was invited by the Epidemiology Student Organization to give a talk here last year, and he said some things I thought that were very profound. One is that this is more often the kind of diagram system you're working with. And secondly, he said that as he's been doing this kind of work, population level, systems analysis, he's found himself self-identifying less and less as an epidemiologist. He's been thinking of his work as less epidemiology than bringing his epidemiologic training and viewpoint, et cetera, to this other enterprise that epidemiology kind of feeds into. So I'm just crossing my fingers, hoping that Sandro and Carey aren't saying, in essence, epidemiology students should stop studying entirely how to study whether E and the extent to which it affects D, and instead should be becoming systems analysts for a reason that I'm going to